My wife mocked my father for being a mechanic. I found their dark secret and made them lose their 200-year legacy. I, 32M, never thought I'd be writing this, but life has a way of coming full circle. 6 years ago, I married into what everyone called old money. My wife's family owned one of the oldest estates in our state, complete with sprawling gardens and a house that could fit my childhood home 10 times over. Growing up in a trailer park, I'd worked my way through community college, then state university, and finally built my own software consulting business. I was proud of what I'd achieved on my own. The first 2 years of our marriage were good, or at least I thought they were. My wife seemed different from her family, more grounded, less obsessed with status. But looking back, maybe I just saw what I wanted to see. Things started changing when her grandmother passed away last year. The reading of the will revealed that the family estate was drowning in debt. Her parents had been keeping up appearances while remortgaging everything they owned. My wife's behavior shifted almost overnight. Suddenly, my background became a source of constant jokes at family gatherings. Imagine growing up where the yard is full of other people's houses, she'd laugh, referring to the trailer park. Or at least you learned to code. Otherwise, you'd still be fixing trucks like your dad. Each comment cut deeper than the last, but I kept quiet, thinking it was just stress from their financial situation. Then came the family dinner 3 months ago. Her father had too much wine and started talking about how they needed to maintain standards in the family. My wife joined in, saying she'd always known marrying someone from my background was risky, but she'd hoped I'd learn proper manners eventually. They didn't realize I was in the next room, hearing everything. That night, I started digging. Their family's reputation was built on an old textile business that had closed in the 80s, but something about the timing of their decline didn't add up. I hired a private investigator, expensive, but worth every penny. What he uncovered was better than anything I could have imagined. The original textile factory hadn't just closed. It had been deliberately run into the ground. Her grandfather had sold off the machinery piece by piece, funneling money into offshore accounts while laying off hundreds of workers. Those workers lost their pensions, their health care, everything. Many were immigrants who couldn't fight back legally. The money from this scheme had funded the family's lavish lifestyle for decades. I spent weeks gathering documentation, meeting with former workers and their families, building a complete picture. Each piece of evidence made me more certain. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice. I found the grandson of the factory's former foreman. He'd been trying to expose the truth for years, but lacked the resources. Together, we built an airtight case. I used my tech skills to follow the money trail, connecting decades-old bank transfers to current accounts. The local newspaper got interested. Then the state investigators. Yesterday, everything came to a head. The investigation went public. My wife's family was hosting their annual garden party, the one event where they paraded their supposed superiority in front of the town's elite. I made sure the news broke right in the middle of it. I watched from my car as police cars pulled up to the estate. My wife's father tried to run, only to find his accounts frozen. Reporters swarmed the property. The look on my wife's face when she saw me watching from across the street. I'll never forget it. All that mockery about my humble background didn't seem so funny anymore. The best part? The factory's land had never been legally sold. Her grandfather's scheme had violated about a dozen laws. Once the court ruling came through, ownership reverted to the workers' collective, which had elected me as their representative, given my role in exposing the truth. So here I am, sitting in what used to be her family's study, writing this on the antique desk they were so proud of. The estate will be converted into a community center and museum, honoring the workers whose lives were destroyed. My wife's family? They're facing charges and civil lawsuits that will take years to resolve. I'm not writing this to brag. I'm writing because I spent too long being ashamed of where I came from. My dad fixed trucks, yeah. He also taught me that honest work matters more than fancy parties. Those simple values my wife mocked? They're the reason I couldn't walk away once I knew the truth. Tomorrow, I'm meeting with a group of the former workers' families to plan the museum's opening. Some of their stories will finally be told. As for my wife, I hear she's moved in with her cousin in another state. The divorce papers are ready to be filed. Sometimes justice takes a generation or two, but it comes around eventually. And sometimes it takes someone from a trailer park to remind these old money families that legacy isn't just about what you inherit, it's about what you choose to do with it. Date. It's been 2 weeks since my last post, and things have gotten more intense than I ever expected. The response to my original post was overwhelming, and several people asked for updates on the situation. Well, you're going to want to sit down for this one. Remember how I mentioned my wife moved in with her cousin? Turns out that wasn't the whole truth. She's been coordinating with her family to try and destroy evidence. But they didn't count on me having backups of everything. The day after my last post, I got a call from one of the former workers' grandchildren. He said someone had broken into his garage where we'd stored some of the original factory documents. I immediately checked my cloud storage and found multiple failed login attempts. Amateur move, I work in tech, remember? Everything important was secured behind two-factor authentication and encrypted. While they were busy trying to hack my accounts, I was meeting with the state prosecutor's office. The evidence we uncovered went deeper than anyone imagined. The factory scheme wasn't just about stealing pensions. They'd been dumping chemicals in the ground for years, knowing it would eventually contaminate the groundwater. The surrounding community, mostly poor immigrants, had experienced unusually high cancer rates for decades. My wife's grandfather had known about it, but buried the environmental reports. I thought I'd seen my wife's true colors before, but I was wrong. She showed up at my office 3 days ago, crying and claiming she'd had no idea about her family's past. Said she wanted to make things right. For a moment, just a moment, I almost believed her. Then I noticed she was recording our conversation on her phone, trying to get me to say something that would discredit the investigation. The next day, one of my clients called to tell me they were pulling their contract. Then another, and another. My wife's family had apparently been contacting everyone they knew, spreading rumors about my business practices. They even tried to claim I had fabricated the evidence to take over their estate after being rejected from their country club. Yeah, seriously. But they made one crucial mistake. One of the clients they contacted was the daughter of a former factory worker. Instead of dropping my company, she came forward with a box of letters her mother had kept. Letters that proved the family had been threatening workers who tried to speak up about the chemical dumping. The prosecutor's office was very interested in those letters, especially since some of the threats were written on my wife's grandfather's personal stationery, the same fancy paper they still used for family announcements. The investigators matched the watermarks. It was like her grandfather had signed his own confession. Yesterday, things took another turn. I was leaving the community center after a meeting with the museum planning committee. A car I didn't recognize followed me for several miles. When I pulled into a busy gas station, it drove away. An hour later, my brother called. Someone had tried to break into my childhood home, the trailer where our dad still lives. Dad's fine. Turns out those simple values include keeping a very loud dog and good relationships with the neighbors. The would-be intruder ran off when the dog started barking, and the neighbor came out with his phone camera rolling. The security footage shows someone who looks suspiciously like my wife's brother, but it's too grainy to be sure. The police are involved now, not just for the break-in attempt, but because we found something else in those letters. References to an accident at the factory in 1979 that killed 3 workers. The official report called it equipment failure. The letters suggest otherwise. I've had to move into a hotel temporarily and hire security for my dad's place. My wife's family might have lost their estate, but they still have connections. Last night, I got an email from an anonymous account offering to make this all go away if I drop the lawsuit and turn over all the evidence. They offered more money than I've made in the last 5 years. I wrote back one sentence. My dad fixes trucks, I fix injustice. Then I forwarded the email to the prosecutor's office. The former workers and their families have started organizing regular meetings at the community center. Last week, an elderly woman brought in her husband's old factory ID card. She hadn't been able to afford a proper frame for it, so she kept it in a plastic sleeve for 40 years. We're having it professionally framed for the museum's opening exhibit. My wife finally filed a countersuit, claiming I married her as part of a long con to steal her family's legacy. Her lawyer quit when we produced emails showing she'd been the one who pursued me, including some where she specifically told her friends she liked that I was different from their usual social circle. Final update. A month has passed since my last update, and I can finally share how everything concluded. Honestly, I'm still processing what happened in these last few weeks. The day after my previous post, my wife's brother was arrested trying to board a private flight to the Cayman Islands. The police found a laptop in his carry-on containing emails about the factory's chemical dumping dating back to the 1970s. They'd kept records of everything, probably to protect themselves if anyone tried to expose them. That arrogance finally caught up with them. But the real bombshell came from an unexpected source. My wife's grandmother's personal nurse contacted me through my lawyer. Turns out, the grandmother hadn't been as oblivious as everyone thought. On her deathbed, she'd recorded a video confession about the factory, the environmental damage, and how the family had covered it all up. She'd given the nurse a sealed envelope with instructions to deliver it if certain events ever came to light. The video was devastating. She named names, provided dates, and explained exactly how they'd hidden their crimes. She even revealed that my wife had known everything since she was 18. Her father had told her the whole story as a lesson in protecting family interests. That revelation broke something in me. All those times my wife had mocked my background, she'd known her family's wealth came from destroying other families' lives. The betrayal hit harder than I expected. I spent a whole night sitting in my old room at my dad's trailer, looking at childhood photos and wondering how I'd missed so many red flags. The next morning, I got a call from the prosecutor's office. They'd struck a deal with my wife's brother. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he provided evidence that implicated several local officials who'd helped cover up the environmental damage. By that afternoon, 2 retired judges and a former EPA administrator were in custody. My wife tried one last desperate move. She held a press conference claiming she discovered the truth about her family independently and had been working with me to expose everything. Said our marriage troubles were just a cover to protect the investigation. The reporters didn't buy it, especially after someone leaked her social media history of mocking, new money, families, and bragging about her heritage. The museum opening was yesterday. We displayed the grandmother's confession video alongside photos of the factory workers and their families. The elderly woman with her husband's ID card cut the ribbon. Her granddaughter, now an environmental lawyer, announced she's starting a foundation to help other communities fight corporate pollution. My dad came to the opening. He stood in his work clothes, still smelling faintly of motor oil, looking at the exhibits. One of the former workers recognized him. Turns out my dad had fixed his truck several times over the years. They spent an hour sharing stories about the old days. Nobody cared about their humble backgrounds. The divorce was finalized this morning. My wife didn't contest it in the end. Her lawyer advised against drawing more attention to the family. She's moving to Europe, apparently. Her parents are facing multiple federal charges. The estate, now community center, has started hosting job training programs. We're using the old ballroom where they used to host their snobbish parties. I've been asked to write a book about all of this. A real publisher reached out, interested in the whole story. I turned them down. This story doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the workers and their families. They'll tell it in their own words in the museum. My dad asked me yesterday if I regret marrying into that family. Honestly, I don't. Not because of any lingering feelings, but because sometimes it takes an outsider to expose the truth. My humble background gave me something they never had, the ability to see through the facade of wealth and recognize real value. The factory site is being cleaned up now. Environmental experts say it'll take years to remove all the contamination. Kind of poetic, really. It'll take just as long to clean up the land as it did for the truth to come out. I'm moving back to my old apartment next week. It's small, nothing fancy, but it's honest. Some of the former workers' families invited me to their monthly barbecue. Said they want to teach me their grandmother's recipes. Funny how life works. I married up looking for acceptance, only to find it among the people my wife's family looked down on. Last night, I found an old photo of my wife and me on my phone. We were at a family dinner, early in our marriage. She was laughing at something, looking carefree and kind. I wondered if that person ever really existed, or if it was just another carefully constructed facade. Then I deleted the photo. Sometimes the biggest revenge isn't about getting even. It's about making things right. The museum tells the truth now, and that's worth more than any inheritance. To everyone who followed this story and offered support, thank you. Remember, your background doesn't determine your character. Your actions do.